June 16, 2023. A remote mountain ridgeline in Alaska. A veteran bush pilot with over 27,000 hours of flying experience takes off with a single passenger. But seconds later, both men are dead. And here's the thing. It wasn't engine trouble. It wasn't poor maintenance. And it wasn't even pilot inexperience. The real killer was something much more deceptive. Something every pilot thinks they can handle. Until it turns on them in an instant. So here's the setup. This wasn't a sightseeing flight or some random weekend trip. This was a working airplane, a 1969 Cessna 180, being flown by Jim Tweto, one of Alaska's most famous bush pilots. If that name sounds familiar, it's because you probably saw him on Flying Wild Alaska, where his life as a remote operator was turned into reality TV. He wasn't just a TV personality, though. This guy was the real deal. He had over 27,000 flight hours, more than most airline captains rack up in an entire career. On this day, Jim was flying for Golden Eagle Outfitters, running hunters and guides out of a tiny 750-foot-long ridgeline strip. Now, let me just pause there. 750 feet. That's not a runway the way you and I think of a runway. That's basically a short stretch of tundra, grass, and rock carved out on top of a mountain. To make things even spicier, it sloped uphill in one direction and downhill in the other. The standard play here was land uphill into the slope, then depart downhill in the opposite direction, dropping into the valley before climbing out. Sounds wild, right? Well, that's Alaska bush flying. It's routine there. And on this day, Jim had already completed one trip without issue, dropping off hunters and returning to load the next passenger. But there was a catch. While he was gone, the wind had started to change. A guide waiting at the strip actually warned him, "Hey, the winds are gusting and shifting around a lot." And that, right there, was the first hint that this was going to be a difficult takeoff. So let's break down what happened. Jim loads up his passenger, Shane Reynolds, a 45-year-old hunting and fishing guide from Idaho. He was heading back after a remote trip, just another hop to the nearest airport. Nothing unusual. The Cessna starts its downhill takeoff roll. From the witness's perspective, it looked fine at first. The engine was running strong, the roll looked normal, no obvious problem, and here's the really crazy part. The witness turned away because, in his mind, it was business as usual. Normally, after lifting off, the plane would dip below the ridgeline, disappear for a moment, then climb back into view on its way out of the valley. But this time, nothing. No engine roar climbing out, no glimpse of the plane reappearing, just silence. The guide ran to the edge of the ridge, and what he saw was horrific. The airplane had smashed into the tundra about 300 feet below, nose first. When investigators pieced together the wreckage, the story became clear. The airplane had veered slightly left during takeoff and struck a small, 12-foot-tall tree that was sitting just off the side of the strip. Now you might think, a little tree? How can that bring down a Cessna 180? But here's the deal. When the stabilizer clipped that tree, it was like a sucker punch. Paint fragments and tree fibers were literally embedded in the tail. That strike upset the aircraft's balance, threw it off control, and seconds later, it slammed into the ground. And this is the part that's extremely frustrating, because the engine was fine. The airplane wasn't overloaded. There were no mechanical issues. Everything about that aircraft was ready to fly. The problem came from outside, from the invisible enemy, the wind. Now here's where things get really interesting. The weather around that ridgeline was a total mess. At Shaktoolik, just 30 miles away, the official station was reporting winds out of the north at 15 to 20 knots. But down at Unalakleet, the station there was showing almost the opposite. Winds out of the southwest at just 5 to 10 knots. And then when another pilot arrived at the crash site, less than an hour later, he described the winds as unusual. He said it would gust 10 to 12 knots from the north, then suddenly calm, and then flip around with a 5-knot push from the south. That's not just shifting wind, that's chaos. And here's the key part. A tailwind is one of those sneaky killers in aviation. On paper, it doesn't look like much. What's 5 or 10 knots, right? But in real life, it's brutal. A tailwind makes your airplane eat up way more runway before liftoff, and once you're in the air, Your climb performance is basically chopped off at the knees. Add gusts into that equation, and it's like rolling the dice. Your safe headwind at the start of the takeoff can literally flip into a tailwind halfway through. Now combine that with a downhill slope, and this is where it gets really crazy. A downhill takeoff means you're lifting off at a higher ground speed, so everything happens faster and your margin over obstacles shrinks to nothing. You're already on the edge, and then the gusts shove you sideways into a tree. It's not hard to see how even a master pilot could lose that battle. That's the hidden killer here. Not the engine, not the weight, not the airplane. It was the invisible hand of wind, working against every single advantage the pilot thought he had. And this is where I want to zoom out for a second, because some people might be tempted to say, well, with 27,000 hours, shouldn't Tweto have known better? But that's exactly the point. He did know better, and yet, the conditions erased all of that experience. Let me explain what I mean. Most bush pilots I know have personal limits. A lot of them will say, no tailwinds, or maybe 5 knots maximum if the strip is forgiving. But personal limits don't mean much when the wind doesn't stay steady. If it's headwind 1 second and tailwind the next, the numbers are out the window. And what about aborting the takeoff? On a normal paved, flat runway, sure, you can chop the power, brake hard, and stop. But on a 750-foot rough strip that's sloping downhill, forget it. By the time you realize the gusts are wrong, you're already committed. A rejected takeoff there might be even more dangerous than pressing forward. That's the horrible catch-22. So how do bush pilots manage it? Honestly, a lot of it comes down to reading the environment. There's no windsock out there. You're looking at the way the tundra grass moves, the ripples on a river, maybe the smoke from a campfire, and you're making a call. But sometimes, the environment just doesn't give you reliable answers. And that's what happened here. This wasn't a case of poor judgment. It was a case of nature stacking the deck against the pilot. The bigger lesson is this. In Alaska, bush flying, skill and experience are essential, but they are not enough. You have to respect the invisible forces, wind shear, sudden shifts, mountain rotors, that can flip the situation from safe to deadly in seconds. And that's exactly what happened on this ridgeline. At the end of the day, this isn't just about physics or pilot technique. It's about 2 men who didn't make it home. Jim Tweto wasn't just a pilot. He was beloved across rural Alaska, famous for opening up communities that would otherwise be isolated. People knew him from flying wild Alaska, but those who lived out there remembered him for something bigger. His generosity, his humor, and his lifelong devotion to connecting people in one of the toughest flying environments on Earth. And his passenger, Shane Reynolds, was a respected outdoorsman from Idaho. He was a hunting and fishing guide, a husband, a father, and a friend to many. For him, this flight was just a ride back after a remote hunting trip. He put his trust in the pilot and in the plane, and the gamble ended in tragedy. After the crash, Alaska's aviation community came together. Memorial flyovers at the Alaska Aviation Museum, tributes from pilots, family statements, they all highlighted both the grief and the respect that Jim and Shane commanded. And when the NTSB finally released its findings, the cause was clear. Gusting tailwind conditions during takeoff, an impact with a tree, loss of control, and terrain impact. A sequence of events that happened in seconds, but ended 2 lives. The real takeaway here? This crash wasn't about recklessness. It wasn't about poor maintenance. It wasn't even about a lack of skill. It was about nature's unpredictability. The one thing even the most experienced pilots can't always beat. And if a legend of Alaska aviation like Jim Tweto can be humbled by it, that's a reminder to every pilot. The sky doesn't care how many hours you've logged. Respect the environment, or it will win.